Thank you all for coming out tonight. Really, I know it's a chilly night, and some of your neighbors were more skittish than you were, so thank you for coming out and joining me. It'll be a nice, cozy talk, and there will be, I can guarantee you, time for each of you to have a question at the end. So, as Sue said, this is my most recent book, and I like to start by pointing out something that gets to part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, in addition to being a lifelong fan of Jackie Robinson. He was a childhood hero of mine, still a hero of mine, I think all of ours, and a lifelong, huge lover of baseball. But the other thing is, and I'm sure like many of you here, I love history, and I talk a lot about history. I've covered a lot of history. I write a lot about history. And one of the things that went into writing this book is the idea behind how we look at history. Specifically, how we very often think we understand a historical event or a historical person, an achievement, an invention, and we don't fully understand the context behind it. In fact, sometimes we think we understand what somebody did or what it was that happened, and it's actually not quite accurate. And that's entirely the case with the breaking of the color barrier in baseball. It's entirely the case with Jackie Robinson. And I will prove it to you with a question. Feel free to chime in. After Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, anybody hazard a guess as to who became the second after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier? Anybody guess who was the second black Major League Baseball player? Roy Campanella is a great guess. I get that a lot. I get Roy Campanella, I get Larry Doby, Hank Aaron. Great guesses, right in the ballpark, as it were. All wrong. No one's ever answered this correctly, because it's a bit of a trick question, because it goes to what I'm talking about. After Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, the second black Major League ball player was Jackie Robinson. Because Jackie Robinson did not do the thing that almost everybody thinks he did. Jackie Robinson didn't integrate Major League Baseball. Didn't do it. Didn't happen. Didn't do it. Now, Jackie Robinson reintegrated Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson reintegrated Major League Baseball. Baseball had already been integrated 60 plus years before Jackie Robinson. Another name that we should know, and most people have never heard of, Moses Fleetwood Walker. But he did what Jackie Robinson is credited with doing. Now, takes nothing away from Jackie Robinson. To reintegrate Major League Baseball was almost harder, in fact, I would say without any question, really. It was far more difficult and challenging for Jackie Robinson to reintegrate it than Moses Fleetwood Walker experienced in integrating Major League Baseball. So what does it tell us? It tells us that, first of all, Jackie Robinson didn't do what most people think he did, and it tells us that Major League Baseball was an outlier in its early days. In the first decades of Major League Baseball, in the decade or two after the Civil War, Major League Baseball, unlike almost every other major American institution, is integrated. It was never integrated by more than one or two. In one case in Newark, New Jersey, 3 black players on an otherwise all-white team. Never happened. It was generally one. But it wasn't like there was just one black Supreme Court justice in 1870. It wasn't like there was just one black president in 1870. So Major League Baseball was an outlier, to its credit. As we'll see, it goes from being to its credit to its everlasting shame, but nonetheless, in its infancy, it looked a little bit more like America than any other major American institution. Bud Fowler, one of the most impassioned, most talented, most heartbreaking stories of the early black ball players. Frank Grant, first black professional player from Massachusetts, the Berkshires. And most famous of all, the Walker brothers. There's Moses Fleetwood sitting right here. Here's his younger brother, Weldy. They were briefly teammates on the Oberlin, Ohio college baseball team in 1881, and Moses Fleetwood Walker was a transformational figure. And I don't mean just because he became the first black Major League ball player. He was an extraordinary athlete, for starters, playing a position that had not called for extraordinary athleticism before Moses Fleetwood Walker. Before Walker, the position of catcher was actually where you stuck the least skilled player on a team. You know, this is the period when the term backstop is coined for the catcher. Now today, to show you how much it's changed, today we think of a physical structure, right? When we think of a backstop, we think of a concrete or wood structure on a field somewhere or in a ballpark where there is netting or fence to keep a batted ball, foul ball from going back and hitting fans. That wasn't the case. The backstop started as a physical person because they weren't playing in ballparks. They were often playing in fields. In fact, in the South, where professional and then Major League Baseball grew the fastest, they were often playing in fields that had just recently been cleared of rubble from the Civil War. So the backstop was where you stuck the biggest guy. They were all guys. It was where you would stick the biggest, least talented guy on the team. Couldn't run, couldn't hit, couldn't throw, but they were big. So you would stick that person behind the plate to keep the ball from rolling off the field and interrupting the flow of the game. He changed it all. He was an extraordinary athlete. Today we would call Moses Fleetwood Walker a five-tool player, right? Every facet of the game he played with extraordinary skill. He could run, he could throw, he could hit with power, he could field his position. So good that gets noticed. And he gets signed by a Major League Baseball team. The Toledo Blue Stockings were a Major League, National League team in the 1880s in Ohio, and he is signed to be the starting catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings to start their 1884 season. And the other part that's transformative about this is look at the date. Look at the date, 1884. The season that is starting almost exactly 20 years after emancipation, 20 years after the end of the Civil War, is starting a black catcher who was born when slavery still existed, whose parents were born into slavery. So this is a very promising event for people who are watching the young national pastime. 20 years after the Civil War, 20 years after emancipation, you have a young black player who's going to become the first black Major League player. So this is, for many, many people, it was a feel-good story of 1884, and for many, many people, most people, it was a sense of progress. It was a welcome sense of progress at a time when a nation that had torn itself apart is still trying to bind itself back together. And by the way, the national pastime was seen as a balm for a nation that had torn itself apart. And this is seen as part of that sense of recovery. Unfortunately, not everybody felt that way about it, and one of those who felt least that way about it was someone who had an oversized influence on Major League Baseball for the period. Because not only did Cap Anson captain the Chicago Cubs, who are the marquee team of the era. You think of the greatest Yankee dynasty of all time. This was the Chicago Cubs in baseball's infancy. They were the marquee team of the era. This is the team that people travel great distances overnight on trains just to see them play and just to see their slugging first baseman captain, Cap Anson, hit a home run. Cap Anson was an incredible player. He's in the Hall of Fame. He still holds to this day, which is incredible because this is the dead ball era we're talking about. The baseball simply didn't go as far as it goes today with the Super Balls that pass for baseballs today. Cap Anson still to this day holds several batting records for the Chicago Cubs. That, to give this man his due, is incredible. That this is from the dead ball era, and he is one of the few people still holding batting records. There are people who hold longevity records, there are people who hold fielding records, there are people who hold stolen base records from that era. That didn't change all that much, but the fact that he still holds batting records from the dead ball era is incredible. all on his plaque in Cooperstown. You know what's not on his plaque in Cooperstown? Cap Anson was also an unrepentant racist. He was a vicious bully, started fights left and right, and apparently had an uncommonly foul mouth, none of which is on his plaque in Cooperstown. So Cap Anson didn't like the fact that his Chicago Cubs were starting out the 1884 season playing against a team that was fielding a black ball player. And I use air quotes because Cap Anson never used the term black. He used another term, and you know what it was, left and right. So he didn't like this enough that he decided to play the game under protest. Following the game, he filed an official grievance with the owners of Major League Baseball, and he informed them that going forward, his Chicago Cubs would no longer take the field against any team that fielded a black ball player. So you can imagine that the owners of Major League Baseball had to take this threat very seriously. This is the marquee team. This is the team that puts fannies in the seats all over the country. And this is the marquee player. Cap Anson is, again, to give him his due, historically, he was the first bona fide superstar of Major League Baseball. So the owners have to take his threat very seriously. Now, they take it seriously. They also don't want to have to deal with it. So they kick it down the can. They kick the can down the road for a couple of years, and then they run out of time because Cap Anson informs them at the start of the 1886 season the Cubs will no longer be playing against any team that fields black ball player or has a black ball player on an active roster. So the owners get together and accede to Cap Anson's demands. In 1887 in Buffalo, New York, that's when the color barrier, the infamous color barrier, baseball's original sin, comes into being. We will never know who voted how, because there was never anything public about the vote. We don't know who exactly voted. We know the owners who we think were there. No one ever answered a single reporter's question about the meeting, about the vote, but nonetheless, the reality was the color barrier became a reality. Going forward, no major or minor league contracts would be offered to any black ball players. Those who were playing under existing contracts like Walker would be allowed to play them out, and there would be no more. The color barrier was now complete. I mentioned Bud Fowler, and I mentioned, if you recall a few moments ago, that his story is one of those few. There are many poignant stories, obviously, in something like this. We're talking about people being cast out and discriminated against and hated and denied doing something that other people were free to do. There's plenty of poignant, moving stories. Bud Fowler's is one of the two I call genuinely heartbreaking stories, because Bud Fowler, unlike almost anyone else that I have ever come across, I don't know of his equal, frankly, lived to play baseball. And when I say lived, I don't mean figuratively. I mean, he lived to play baseball as in he lived playing baseball every single day of the year. He circumnavigated the hemisphere in order to do that. He would play baseball in North America when it was summer up here, and as summer turned to fall, he would start making his way down through the South, then down through Central America, then down through the Caribbean, and ultimately he'd be playing in South America when it was winter up here, and he would repeat the cycle all over again. And now, with the advent of the color barrier, he was in a position where he was no longer able to play the single thing that seemed to give his life purpose, to give his life meaning. He died of a blood disorder in Frankfort, New York in 1913. He was only 55 years old. His unmarked grave told not a word of a truly extraordinary life. For years since the color barrier began to spread, Fowler had relentlessly fought for a place in organized baseball. Along with all the other early black ball players, he continued to try and play in the shadow of the descending barrier as teams shed black ball players and refused to sign more. He had uncommon talent, there's no question about it. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame, after all, just this past summer. But for most people who were observing Fowler as the end came, it seemed to them that his singular talent was in seeming to somehow persevere by himself and try to outrun the color barrier when everyone knew that the end was inescapable. For Bud Fowler, the end came in 1895. He was finally out of options. They all were. But Bud Fowler was literally the last black ball player standing. My skin is against me, Fowler wrote in 1895. If I hadn't been born quite so black, I might have cut on as a Spaniard, something of that kind. You never know. My black skin just bars me. Now, as the 20th century unfolded, it barred them all. It would take another 50 years of fierce Fowler-like will and determination to break through again. So now the color barrier falls in 1887. Now we're up into the 1890s. And now segregation goes on steroids. So this is the period when Jim Crow doesn't just move in, Jim Crow throws his weight around, because this is the period that is kicked off by what many jurists consider the single worst Supreme Court decision in American history, Plessy versus Ferguson. So I won't tax you to remember your high school history if you don't remember, but Plessy versus Ferguson starts as a transportation issue in Alabama. It goes to Georgia, and it involves black passengers being barred from riding on conveyances like trains unless there is a separate, dedicated, colored, as they put it, car. It goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court finds for Alabama. It was the separate but equal dictum, which was always 50% true. It was always separate, never equal. And now we said baseball was an outlier. Now baseball's not an outlier, right? So now it doesn't matter whether you are playing baseball. It doesn't matter whether you're going after a job. It doesn't matter whether you are trying to vote. It doesn't matter whether you are trying to get a drink at a public water fountain. Segregation, it's important to note, is now not just pervasive everywhere. It's state sanctioned. It is state sanctioned segregation. So when you get into this period between 1900 and 1920, and we'll see why I'm saying 1920, there's another, I think, historical misconception that in this wilderness era, right, of blacks being barred from Major League Baseball, that they weren't playing baseball. Utterly untrue. Not only that, the level of black baseball in this period was as good or better than anything in the Negro Leagues, because it was all they had. They had these black barnstorming teams, and there was only about a dozen good ones playing, which meant all the talent, all the elite talent of black baseball had to funnel onto just these 10 or 12 teams. And they crisscrossed the country in these rickety buses. You've seen movies, Bingo Long, all that stuff. It was all true. And they crisscrossed the country in these rickety buses, and they played these barnstorming teams, and they often played major league teams. They frequently played white teams, and they frequently played major league teams. This is long before TV. Players weren't making $14.5 million a year or $75,000 an at-bat, as some players do today. So when a major league team had a down day, they played anybody they could. Anybody. Teams just wanted to pick up extra games, pass the hat, sell some tickets. So they frequently played these barnstorming black teams. And they frequently lost to these barnstorming teams. In fact, in one celebrated incident, the Cincinnati Redlegs, as they were known then, the Cincinnati Reds dropped an entire weekend series of 3 games to the Chicago Black Giants. And the owner of the Cincinnati Reds at that time, on Monday morning, promptly forbade the team from ever playing any more black barnstorming teams. It was embarrassing, right, to the Cincinnati Reds. Now, one of those players, I said, we were going to say the other end of the bookend period was 1920. One of the pitchers of that team that beat the Reds in 3 games was this man, Rube Foster, who pitched 2 of those 3 games in a weekend series. This guy apparently did not need 6 days in between starts. So Rube Foster is another transformational figure. He is often called the father of black baseball. He is the father of the Negro Leagues, the creator of the Negro Leagues, which, as we'll see, is the single most important, single most vital, single most significant unsung hero in the entire struggle to break the color barrier. Without the Negro Leagues, the color barrier does not fall, at least when it does. In 1947, Rube Foster was a fearsome presence on the mound. Texas kid, weighed about 245 pounds, stood about 6'2", 6'3". It was said that it was absolutely terrifying to stand in against him. Part of the reason for that was apparently, part of the reason was that he very, very often had very little idea where the ball was going. So pre-batting helmet, that's a concern. But Rube Foster understood something. Listen, other people understood it too, and there were, in fact, a couple of different attempts to create an organized league during the period of these barnstorming teams, to create an organized black league of players, but they never panned out. It pans out for Rube Foster because Rube Foster sells it in a way that enough potential owners of what would be Negro League teams felt like the time had come and that he was the ambassador to make it happen. His motto to these people, his slogan was, "We, the coming Negro Leagues, are the ship. Do you want to be on the ship or do you want to be in the sea?" And enough Negro League owners bought into that to create the Negro Leagues. So 1920, just almost this time of year, in 1920, Kansas City, Missouri, Rube Foster, sitting right here in the front row in the middle, founds the Negro Leagues. This is the founding class of the Negro Leagues. I want to draw your attention, because he's going to come up again and again, and this is his first time coming up. I want to draw your attention to this gentleman right here, right there. J.L. Wilkinson. J.L. Wilkinson was the only white owner in the entire history of the Negro Leagues. Born in 1920, they begin to fall apart in the mid-1960s, really fall apart. By 1970, they're all gone. The reason I bring it up, though, is not to point him out as some sort of racial peculiarity. The reason I point it out is that we are, after all, talking about breaking the color barrier. We're talking about Jackie Robinson, and there is a direct line from this day, when that picture's taken in 1920, 25 years out, straight shot to Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Because J.L. Wilkinson, owner of the legendary Kansas City Monarchs, will be the Negro League owner that gives Jackie Robinson his first job as a professional baseball player. And after that, it will just be 6 months until Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. So the Negro Leagues are born, the Negro Leagues take off. They take off to an extent nobody could have predicted. They take off with the same explosive growth that the major leagues experienced when they began in the 1870s, 1880s. They go from 14 founding teams to 26 to 32 teams. They're able to separate into a Negro National League, a Negro American League. They're able to have the first of 2 Negro League World Series. They suddenly showcase all this elite black baseball talent had been sort of bottled up among these just 10 or 12 barnstorming teams. And now all of a sudden, there are all these other teams, and there's sort of this gusher of black baseball talent. Pops Lloyd, really the first bona fide black home run hitter. Judy Johnson, one of the most colorful, along with Roy Dandridge, one of the most colorful black players of all time. A decade or so later, Oscar Charleston, one of the greatest fielding players in baseball history, period. And I had to stick him in here. My personal all-time favorite baseball player, second to Sandy Koufax, is James Cool Papa Bell. Papa Bell is, according to almost all, it's pretty unanimous at this point, baseball historians, undoubtedly the fastest human being to have ever played baseball. Cool Papa Bell. Amazing story. Satchel Paige had a great anecdote about his roommate, Cool Papa Bell. He said that how fast was Cool Papa? He said one night, we shared a room in St. Louis, and I remember one night I was already in bed and Cool Papa was fixing to get into bed, and I said, "Cool Papa, would you hit the lights?" Well, do you know he hit the light? Room was dark before Cool Papa was under the covers. So that's how fast Cool Papa Bell was. But here's the thing. That first decade of the Negro Leagues is the 1920s. And it looks like the sky will be the limit for the growth of the Negro Leagues until we get to the very end of the 1920s. Because the very end of the 1920s is not about the sky being the limit, but about the roof falling in. I sometimes think that we forget that when it comes to the Great Depression, we forget how cataclysmic it was, how catastrophic it was, what destruction it wrought, how many people it brought low, lives it destroyed. We just think of it, I think, in later decades as in terms of, this financial thing. It wasn't a financial thing. It was a brutal, horrific reordering of life, lives destroyed. Maybe some of you have, relatives, parents, grandparents. My late dad was 10, 11 years old in the first worst years of the Depression, 30, 31, 32. You look at the numbers, and they still stunned 25% unemployment. We've had unemployment in America just within the last decade functionally under 1%. It's barely at 3% now. 25%, a quarter of all Americans unemployed. That's nothing. In minority communities, there were only a quarter working. 75% unemployed in minority communities like Atlanta, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Businesses, 30,000 plus businesses going under in the first worst years of the Great Depression, including the Negro Leagues, gone, up in smoke, with one exception, as we'll see. Now, you might wonder how many Major League teams survived the Great Depression, because after all, each of the then 16 Major League teams was in and of itself a thriving American business, subject to the same calamity that was befalling 30,000 plus other businesses that were going under. Not so many went out of business. Now, the reason for that is clear, and the only reason I bring this up is to show the distinction between the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues. Obviously, the Negro Leagues played with nothing like the material advantages that the Major Leagues had. They didn't travel even on trains for the most part. They took buses, but that's nothing. The Major Leagues were insulated from the worst effects of the Great Depression because at that time, look, most professional team, never mind baseball, owners today are still, for the most part, wealthy white men. But the cost of buying any, not just baseball, Major League professional team today are becoming so stratospheric, and you mark my words, before the end of this decade, a professional team will sell for $1 billion. But at that time, all 16 Major League owners were fabulously wealthy white men. Now, to get to their credit, almost all of them were very successful businessmen who had steered their businesses after a lot of hard work and sacrifice to very, very successful play, except not him. Tom Yawkey, the reason I bring up Tom Yawkey is not to pile on Tom Yawkey. The reason I bring up Tom Yawkey is to give you a sense of just how wealthy his fellow owners were, because Tom Yawkey was officially the pauper of Major League owners. He was the poorest of the 16 Major League owners. And Tom Yawkey had come into $16.34 million when he turned 18. He came into another $16.34 million and the rest of his trust when he turned 21. And he was the poorest of the bunch. Now, I mentioned the Cubs. Just to give you a sense of reference, the Cubs were owned by a guy named Phil Wrigley. I know that all of us in this room, do I have my gum on me? I know that all of us in this room have used Mr. Wrigley's products. I was just chewing on his product before I walked in here. Cardinals were owned by Gussie Busch. Gussie Busch was brewing a little beer out in St. Louis. Out in the East Coast, speaking of beer, Colonel Jake Rupert was brewing Knickerbocker beer and owning the Yankees. These guys were fabulously more wealthy than Tom Yawkey. So the Major Leagues survived intact. The Negro Leagues are gone, with one exception. And we're back to our friend J.L. Wilkinson, owner of the Kansas City Monarchs. J.L. Wilkinson, fascinating figure. Google him sometime. Fascinating figure. Very, very progressive. Not even just for his time. He would be today a very progressive figure, which is just, he's a remarkable person. And when the Depression hit, he told his team that he would try his best to keep everybody on salary and not lay anybody off. But he told them that the only way we're going to be able to do that is to be able to keep playing baseball pretty much nonstop. So he bought his team a bus. Here they are, barnstorming their way through Canada during the Great Depression. But they wouldn't be able to do this forever. No way. Now, fortunately, they didn't have to, because the single most unlikely event in this entire story takes place now. In the first years of the Great Depression, and it's not just the fact that it was an unlikely event to begin with, right? The Negro League's being reborn. Nothing's being reborn during the Great Depression. The Great Depression is when things died left and right. Nothing's being reborn, but the Negro Leagues are reborn, and look where they're reborn. Ground zero of American unemployment, Pittsburgh, PA. And, stranger still, the two people responsible for bringing the Negro Leagues back to life. You might think you're looking at two guys, obviously from Pittsburgh, two African-American men who seem to like sports. One of them likes cigars. You might think that these guys, maybe they were buds and no. They were arch enemies. These two guys hated each other's guts, but the only thing they ever cooperated on was the best thing they ever did in their lives, which was bringing the Negro Leagues back to life. Cumberland Posey Jr., son of a pioneering black figure in Pittsburgh. His father, Cum Posey Sr., was the first licensed civil engineer, black civil engineer in Pennsylvania. He founded 2 or 3 very successful businesses. I'm sure he'd hoped that his young son, Cum Posey Jr., would follow into the family business, but Cum Posey Jr. was a sports fanatic. Basketball, which was a relatively new sport then, and baseball, which won out. It won out mostly because he was approached in the late 1920s about saving a legendary black ball club in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Grays. The Homestead Grays, Homestead section of Pittsburgh, and they are up for sale, and if nobody buys them, they're just going to be gone. And Cumberland Posey Jr. managed to cobble some money together. His dad loaned him some money, and he was able to buy the Homestead Grays. So he had already been, he had played baseball, played basketball, coached both, had never managed a team, had never been a general manager, and now he was everything. He was manager, coach, owner, general manager, ticket seller, promoter, you name it. He was doing it. It turns out, though, that Cum Posey's greatest, perhaps his greatest skill was something that had never been seen before, which was that he had an incredible gift of inspiring his players, young athletes. How well did he inspire his athletes? Better to just look at the result. So 1931, his debut season as owner, manager of the celebrated Homestead Grays. And all they did was have the greatest season of any baseball team before or since anywhere on the face of the earth. Let me put into context a little bit what 143 wins means for baseball. First of all, at that time, Major League Baseball played 154 games, not the 162 of today. They almost went undefeated. Okay, so, and baseball teams don't do that. If a baseball team today, in today's era, if a Major League Baseball team today wins 100 games, that's like once a decade a team will win 100 or more games. They won 143. Let me bring it up to today. There are today, 2023, 3 Major League teams that cumulatively, all 3 together, have not won 143 games in the past 2 years. They won 143 in 1 year. Now, his archenemy, Gus Greenlee, promptly almost outdid him. Gus Greenlee, completely different story. Hardscrabble youth, one of 6 brothers, goes off to fight in World War I to have a job, gets wounded at the Battle of Verdun, decorated, comes back to Pittsburgh. Now it's both Prohibition and the Great Depression. You can't even get a drink to drown your sorrows. Cobbles some money together, buys a rickety old jalopy. He's going to drive a cab for a living. Guy comes up to him one day, he says, "Hey, pal, is this your cab?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "How would you like to a little more money? How would you like to run our bootleg liquor around?" He was a representative of the Latrobe Brewing Company, which, if you've ever had a Rolling Rock beer, that was them. Now, they were still brewing, not legally, but who was brewing legally? They were all still brewing. And he did that. Then a guy comes up to him one day and says, "How would you like to make a little extra money? You can run some numbers, the bets around for me in my bookie." So he started doing that, running the numbers around, booking bets on the fights, on the football games, and so forth and so on. Smart cookie, Gus Greenlee, great businessman. Crooked, but great businessman. Realizes that, you know what, if I could just get rid of the middleman in these cases here, I could make all the money myself. So he does. And he starts doing it all by himself, and he starts making more money than you can imagine. How much more than you can imagine? At one point during the Great Depression, Gus Greenlee was making $12,500 a week. Now, without taxing you with doing the math, I did tax an MIT economist who I know for a fact regretted ever taking my phone call. Took him a couple of months, but he did it. He got back to me. If you were making $12,500 a week in the worst years of the Great Depression, adjusted for today's numbers and adjusted for the average family, you were making the equivalent of $11.9 million a week. So he doesn't know what to do with all his money, and he builds a jazz club. Another great story to Google, the Crawford Grill. Crawford Grill was a melting pot, remarkable place. Every single jazz great of the era, Billie Holiday, Ella, Cab Calloway, Gillespie, you name it, Armstrong, all played the Crawford Grill. And he's approached about saving another legendary ball club in Pittsburgh. And he says, yeah, I'll save the club. I'll buy the club. I have no idea how much Gus Greenlee liked baseball. I'll tell you what he did like, both about the jazz club and owning a ball club. They were great places to launder all his dirty money. So buys the ball club, changes the name to the Pittsburgh Crawfords so he can cross-promote his grill. Smart business guy. And the Crawfords are reborn. And 1 year after his arch enemy wins 143 games, Gus Greenlee wins almost 100 games. And he did it the same way he did almost everything else he achieved in life. He stole it. When I say he stole it, he poached the two best players off his archenemy's team. Now, to be fair, both of these guys poached each other's best players all the time. They made it into an art form and an ongoing tradition. But when I say he poached the two best players from the Homestead Grace, that is true. There's no question about that. They also happen to be two of the greatest players who have ever played the sport of baseball. Starting with this tall, lanky pitcher in the back here named Satchel Paige, and your friend, a slugging young catcher named Josh Gibson. It is impossible to overstate how significant both of these players were in breaking the color barrier, which might seem odd because in some ways none of them had anything to do with it, and in other ways they had everything to do with it just by being who they were. There's nothing unsung hero-like about either one of these guys. In fact, I always say Page and Gibson are the only two sung heroes in the whole book. They were legends in their own lifetimes. Satchel Paige is bigger than life. Satchel Paige is still, I think, one of the most colorful Americans in history. He would be on my list of the 5 greatest pitchers who've ever held a baseball. Josh Gibson was only too happy for the most part. Very quiet man. Tragic life, very quiet, very shy, very soft-spoken, and was always happy to have his friend and roommate and often teammate Satchel Paige take all the attention so that he didn't have to talk, but he was a legend in his own right. Slugging catcher. It was said that you hadn't heard a bat hit a baseball till you heard Josh Gibson hit a baseball. It's funny, you read these accounts of people saying they would stand during batting practice just so they could hear him hit a baseball. It sounded like something exploding. May have hit the longest home run ever hit at Yankee Stadium, prodigious home run hitter, known even in his playing days, universally, by whites, as the Black Babe Ruth. Funny story. Late in his playing days, Josh Gibson met the real-life Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth apparently put his big meaty arm around him like I guess he liked to do. And he shook him a little bit like he liked to do. And he said, "Mr. Gibson, what a goddamn honor this is." He said, "Hey, I understand they call you the Black Babe Ruth. How's that feel?" And Josh Gibson in his little squeaky voice said, "Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Ruth. My people call you the White Josh Gibson. How's that feel?" Now, how do we know so much about the Negro Leagues? We've just spent the first 15 plus minutes talking about the Negro Leagues, which is the way it should be because the Negro Leagues are in many ways the most important part of the saga of breaking the color barrier. The question is, how do we know so much about them? Now, I want you to think about it because the Negro Leagues didn't keep any records. The Negro Leagues were a hand-to-mouth operation. Every Negro League game was about having enough money to make sure you had enough bats and balls, the players had cleats, that the players had a decent uniform, even though they were often mended and sewn up, and making sure you could get to the game, that you had a bus and you had gas in the tank of the bus. They were not keeping records. They did not have statisticians like baseball, Major League Baseball today, that has 5.5 floors in New York City just devoted to stats. You can look up, Google the first, go ahead and do it sometime. You can look at, Google the very first Major League game played and you will see the stats for the game. Now, if the Negro Leagues were not keeping stats and records, and they were not, if the white mainstream papers did not cover the Negro Leagues, and they were not covering the Negro Leagues, except when they were playing a big game against a major league team. There was never in the entire history of the Negro Leagues a single beat reporter for a single white mainstream newspaper that covered either a single Negro League team or the entire Negro Leagues as a whole. Not one. How would we possibly know all this about the Negro Leagues? Another great unsung hero. In fact, the second to the Negro Leagues, the second most vital, significant unsung hero in the entire saga, the black press. The black press. Without the black press, we simply would not know what we know about black baseball. Major League Baseball will tell you, would be the first to tell you that. In fact, the fact that Major League Baseball, just as of 2 years ago, is now keeping Negro League records on the same level and the same database as Major League records, where do you think they get it from? They have been able to get it from the black press, from the archives of the black press. These were pioneering publishers who are incredible, incredible people in terms of journalism, in terms of the press in America. Robert Lee Vann, founder and publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier, greatest distribution of any black newspaper in American history, just slightly more so than Robert Sengstack Abbott's equally legendary Chicago Defender. And they hired pioneering sports writers like Wendell Smith, Sam Lacey, and these writers were charged by these publishers in a way that journalists are never charged today. They were charged with having an editorial opinion in one sense, which of course is supposed to be verboten for journalists. But they were charged with making sure, by these publishers, and making sure that when you cover a game, you let people know that these players, I'll give you a perfect example, 1939. Satchel Paige, leading the black Yankees, pitches at Yankee Stadium against the New York Yankees, strikes out Joe DiMaggio 3 times. Only time in DiMaggio's entire storied career that he struck out 3 times. When DiMaggio retired, he said he was asked, what pitcher would you never want to face again? And even though he only faced him 1 time, he said Satchel Paige. He said I couldn't hit him. He managed a bloop single in the 9th inning off the handle of the bat. He said, I felt like a fool against Satchel Paige. So that game, Wendell Smith covered it, and his editor and boss, Robert Lee Vann, told him, you make sure when you write up your piece about the game, you make sure people understand. If they want to see Satchel Paige pitch for the Yankees, they can do it. In fact, he said the Pittsburgh Courier will send over a contract on behalf of Satchel Paige to the management of the New York Yankees overnight, tonight, and you remind them why that can't happen because of the color barrier. And he also reminded Wendell Smith, and you remember, Mr. Smith, why you can't write for the New York Times. Same reason. So they did. They did, and they reached audiences all over America. That story reached readers, white readers, all over America. That story by Wendell Smith about that game in 1939 reached readers in Bangor, Maine, Boston, Miami, Chattanooga, Fort Worth, Phoenix, Chicago, San Francisco, Spokane. How? How? The Pittsburgh Courier, these black papers, just like the Negro Leagues that they were covering, were hand-to-mouth operations. It was all they could do to have the money and the capital in place to meet deadlines 6 nights a week and get their paper out to the 5 or 6 newsstands just in the black community. How were they getting their papers all over the country? The single most improbable ally in the entire story of breaking the color barrier, the Pullman Porters. You know, I would say I knew something about a lot of these people we've talked about. Something, just because I am a lover of baseball history. Obviously, I learned much, much more in my research for the book. I knew nothing about the Pullman Porters. Nothing. I knew nothing about their role in breaking the color barrier. And it's fascinating. Because the Pullman Porters, unlike everybody else we've talked about, had nothing on the surface to do with baseball. The Pullman Porters were the face of overnight train travel in the heyday of rail, 1920s, 30s, 40s, a little bit into the 50s. They were servants on wheels. That's what they were. That's exactly how George Mortimer Pullman described the mission of the Pullman Porters. It was to be servants on wheels. They would show you your seat, show you to your berth later. They would keep track of who needed a wake-up call, or at that time, a wake-up knock. What did they have to do with baseball? We mentioned those publishers, the pioneering black press publishers. These guys were visionary businessmen. You know, if you own a newspaper, unlike so today, if you own a website, right, it's all about attracting eyeballs that perch on your site for at least a certain amount of time. That's how you get advertising revenue. For newspapers, it was and still is, for the 3.5 papers that are left in this country, it still is about circulation. People got to pick up the newspaper. They got to buy the newspaper. You can wrap fish in it later, but as long as you buy the newspaper, but you got to have circulation. You got to constantly be worried about increasing your circulation or you'll die. And they saw in the Pullman Porters a potential extraordinary ally in the effort to increase the circulation of the papers. Because what did the Pullman Porters do? I mean, they did their job on the trains, but what did the trains do? They crisscrossed all over the country in a way that no whites were doing. People couldn't afford that at that time. People weren't traveling all around the country. They were. And these publishers thought, wow, if we could just bring some of them in as allies to help deliver black newspapers around the country. And they did. They didn't need all the Pullman Porters. They just needed a few on a few runs a week going in different directions, and they got that. Obviously, it was completely under the table. It was completely, if any of these porters had ever been caught delivering black newspapers, they would have been fired on the spot. And not a single one ever was. Now you might wonder, how did it work? How did it work? So let's say a train is leaving South Station, Boston for a run down the entire eastern seaboard ending in Miami. The porters also helped provision the train, right? They were responsible for getting the food on board. So let's say the train is leaving Boston and the Pullman Porters who make the Boston run have a deal with a black bakery in Roxbury, Mattapan, Forest Hills, you name it. Right? So the little bakery truck pulls up to South Station. At that time, you could pull right out on the platform. Little bakery truck has a little platform in the back, 3 or 4 or 5-foot-tall wicker baskets filled with bread. Underneath the bread, black newspapers from Boston. The Boston Recorder, Boston Guardian, the Boston Chronicle, I'm proud to say. Not related, but train leaves the station. They get to, let's say, first stop Penn Station, New York. They offload surreptitiously the Boston black newspapers. They take on the Amsterdam News from New York. They do the same thing in Baltimore. They do the same thing in D.C. They do the same thing all the way down to Miami. And in this way, these papers are reaching white readers, which is exactly what these publishers wanted to happen, especially with the color barrier issue, right? So white readers, they understood, just like Rube Foster understood. It will be whites that will need to be reminded constantly about the color barrier because it is whites who control Major League Baseball. If we are to get back into Major League Baseball, it will be white minds that need to change, not black ones. So the papers are reaching people all over America. And now we are at 1940 in our story, which means we have less than 10 minutes left in our talk. and only 5 minutes left, only 5 years left in the entire story, and spoiler alert, in the next 10 minutes, the color barrier will fall. In the next 5 years and 10 minutes, the color barrier will fall. Jackie Robinson will make a triumphant entrance. How? Baseball in 1940 is no closer to dropping the color barrier than it had been in 1930, 1920, 1910, all the way back. So what changes? What changes is that the decade of the 1930s ends with another worldwide cataclysm, of course, World War II. And in New York, Lester Rodney becomes the first person and first journalist to put the issue of the color barrier in the context of the coming World War. Lester Rodney was nobody's profile of an ally in the struggle to break the color barrier. First of all, New York wasn't even a focus of the fight. It had long been Chicago and Pittsburgh and Washington and so forth. But now in the 1940s, it becomes part of the focus, partly because of Lester Rodney, nobody's profile. First of all, he just didn't look the part. I mean, he was white, he was Jewish, he was a communist. Hey, nobody's perfect, okay? But he also was a gifted writer. He was a gifted baseball writer, loved baseball, hated the color barrier. And he understood that with the war, this presented a new level of immorality when it comes to the color barrier. And that's what he started to remind his readers, that America is going to war. Blacks as well as whites are right now training to go fight. Blacks as well as whites will be asked to die if necessary to defend democracy. And those who return to this country, having been asked to die if necessary, will be denied a seat on a bus or the opportunity to play Major League Baseball. This is the argument that finally brings the color barrier down. This is the one that brings it down. And that argument is picked up by, we mentioned those newspaper publishers, that argument is picked up by, for instance, the Pittsburgh Courier, which tries to offer through that argument a rationalization for what was an agonizing decision among young black men and women going off to fight. Do you want to die for a country that values you as a second-class citizen? Really? So the double victory campaign, spawned by Lester Rodney's argument, was meant to help give some level of rationalization. Yes, fight. Defeat Adolf Hitler. Come home, defeat Jim Crow. That handkerchief, which was given out, the Double V campaign, was given out through the Pittsburgh Courier's newspaper. It was worn on the bomber jacket sleeve of every single member of the Tuskegee Airmen. But it is another celebrated all-black unit that takes us to the end of the story. And it is a unit that you probably have never heard of. It's the 761st Armored Battalion. The 761st, the original fighting Black Panthers, was the very first all-black armored unit. They fought with Patton's Third Army, set consecutive records for consecutive days at the front, one of the first units to cross over into Germany, one of the first units to liberate a death camp. But what makes them part of this story is that they were led right here. They were led by a young lieutenant named Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Jackie Robinson got his lieutenant stripes at Fort Kearny in Kansas in 1940. He was transferred in 41 to help take control of the 761st, and he could not wait to lead the 761st against the Nazis from the turret of a tank. Didn't get there. The 761st did, without its young lieutenant. Just before the 761st shipped out, Robinson flunked his final physical. An old football injury, knee had popped up. He had been an All-American halfback at UCLA, not cleared for combat. Desperately asks for permission to accompany the unit as a special morale officer. Request denied. Robinson said it was the single most crushing disappointment of his life. Unit ships out. Jackie Robinson leaves the hospital. He decides he's going to return to the base on Fort Hood. He's going to get a drink at the Black Officers Club, drown his sorrow. Gets on the bus. Takes a seat in the front row, right behind the bus driver. You probably can figure where this is going. At that time, whether it was on a military base or in a city or a town, wherever, blacks on buses were expected to move to the back of the bus when the bus began to fill up with white passengers, as this bus did. But Jackie Robinson knew something that the bus driver later testified he didn't know. I don't think, had he known, he may not have done anything differently. But the bus filled up. Robinson was asked to go to the back of the bus. Robinson refused. But Robinson knew he didn't have to move, because Robinson knew that 48 hours earlier, President Roosevelt had signed an executive order prohibiting segregation, discrimination on domestic American military bases. But nonetheless, bus driver pulled over to a sentry post. 2 MPs came on the bus. They handcuffed Robinson, took him off the bus. He was arrested, court-martialed, insubordination. I don't know how many of you know that Jackie Robinson was once court-martialed. I'm guessing you didn't know. I always say that the odd thing is that if you knew that Jackie Robinson had been court-martialed, and if he had actually been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the Army, you might be one of the few people in America who knew who Jackie Robinson was, because he never, ever would have broken the color barrier. Branch Rickey would have never been able to sign him. But Robinson beat the court-martial. He won. He was honorably discharged, and then he needed a new job. And he's about to trade his Army uniform for a baseball uniform, because he's told by some friends that our friend J.O. Wilkinson, owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, is desperate for some ball players because many of his best players have not yet returned from Europe. So Robinson writes him a letter, and he says, Mr. Wilkinson, I'm Jackie Robinson, and I'm wondering if I could have a tryout with the Monarchs for the upcoming 1945 season. And Wilkinson doesn't write back. He picks up the phone, and he calls Jackie Robinson. He says, Jackie Robinson, this is J.L. Wilkinson. First of all, I know who you are. Second of all, no, you can't have a job with the Monarchs. There was a long pause. Robinson was stunned. He said, do you want to know why you can't have a job with the Monarchs? And Robinson said, yes, I would like to know that. You already have one. Now get yourself to Houston in spring training, because I need you to be my second baseman. See you soon, J.L. I wish I had met J.L. Wilkins. But Robinson promptly heads to Houston to start the baseball season. And now we only have 6 months before the end of the story and less than 6 minutes. So, you may not know, if you didn't know Jackie Robinson was court-martialed, you may also not know that less than 3 weeks after this picture was taken of Jackie Robinson taking the field on opening day in Kansas City, that in Boston, the final battle of the color barrier will be fought, and Jackie Robinson will not be in a Monarchs uniform in 3 weeks. He will be in a uniform that the Boston Red Sox have given him to go out on the field and have a tryout for the Boston Red Sox, because at the same time he's preparing to start the season in Boston, this guy, Izzy Muchnick, is desperately trying to arrange a tryout for some black ball players. Izzy Muchnick has been influenced by Lester Rodney's argument, and he has been trying to find a way. Brilliant young lawyer, Harvard Law School, and he sits on the Boston City Council, second Jewish Boston City councilor. He'd become the first Jewish chairman of the Boston School Committee. He was consumed with finding a way to force some major league teams like the Red Sox, where he was in Boston, to have a tryout, specifically for some of these great Negro League players who have been fighting for America in Europe. And couldn't they have a tryout with some of these major league teams? But he knew he needed leverage. He knew he needed leverage. The guy's a tough young cookie. He knows it isn't enough to write to the Red Sox and say, would you please consider? He's not going to do that. He knows he needs some leverage. He knows he needs some juice. And he finds it. He finds it in the form of one of those old blue laws. Remember, though? This was a blue law that still existed in 1945 that prohibited baseball from being played in Sundays in Boston without the unanimous vote of the Boston City Council. And Izzy Muchnick late one night when he sees this in these zoning ordinances and bylaws, I think probably had to pinch himself because he realized, I have leverage. I'm a city councilor. All I got to do is threaten to withhold my vote, and I got him good. So he wrote a letter to the brain trust of the Boston Red Sox. There they are. There's Yawkey, there's player manager Joe Cronin, and general manager Eddie Collins, himself a Hall of Famer, who received the letter. And in it, Izzy Muchnick said, "Dear Mr. Collins, there are right now, as you well know, some very, very qualified Negro baseball players returning from the war, and I am asking the Red Sox to consider giving some of the best of them a tryout. Not a job, just a tryout. After all, it's the least we can do." And Eddie Collins, kind of a charming, loquacious Southern guy, writes back and he says, "Mr. Muchnick, I certainly empathize with your request." But he said, "I would point out to you that in my entire tenure with the Boston Red Sox, not a single black ball player has ever inquired about a job. I can only surmise that there's no interest." Well, Izzy Muchnick was a tough guy. Bulldog, played goal for Harvard's hockey team, no mask. He understood when he was taking a load of incoming you-know-what. So he waited a little bit, waited a little more. He waited until it was virtually 1 week to the day before the vote was to be taken for Sunday baseball in the city council chamber, and he sent a cablegram this time to Eddie Collins. And he said, "Mr. Collins, it appears you have no interest in entertaining my sincere request, and therefore this cable should serve to inform you that when the vote for Sunday baseball is taken in the city council chamber of Wednesday next, I will be withholding my vote." I don't know what the actual time duration it was from the time Eddie Collins opened that cablegram to the time he appeared in his boss Tom Yawkey's office. I have a very good sense that he was running, and it was well under 2.5 minutes, because that would have been a calamity for the Red Sox. 1945, pre-TV, baseball, Major League Baseball is almost entirely ticket sale revenue dependent, and on Sundays, every single Major League team plays a doubleheader. The Red Sox would have been denied 50% of their Sunday revenue in 1945. Unthinkable. They realized they got to have the damn tryout. So they send a cable back to Izzy Muchnick. They said, "Fine." Pretty much verbatim. "Fine. You can have your tryout. 3 players. That's it. 3. No press or the deal's off. Have them at Gate D, Fenway Park, the morning of April 12th, 11 a.m. Now, Izzy Muchnick knew a lot about Boston's bylaws. He did not know a lot about black baseball, so he consulted our friend Wendell Smith, and he asked him to handpick 3 qualified black ball players to have a tryout with the Red Sox. And Wendell Smith came up with the 3 players. Among them was a celebrated infielder in Kansas City by the name of Jackie Robinson. They trooped to Boston, all set to have a tryout on April 12th. Unfortunately, didn't happen because history intervened on April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt died, and America shut down. 24 hours later, America opened back up. 48 hours later, America is completely back to normal for all intents and purposes, except at the offices of the Boston Red Sox, where it appears they are in the midst of inconsolable grief. Really, what they were trying to do was play out the clock, pure and simple. And they almost made it. They almost made it. All they had to do was get to the afternoon of April 16th, because on the afternoon of April 16th, they get a train to New York City where they open up the season against the Yankees on the 17th. Didn't make it. Because on the morning of April 16th, a white sports writer, Dave Egan of the old Herald American, broke the story. Front page, kind of a poignant letter to Bostonians. "You are not aware of it, dear reader," he said, "but at this hour there are 3 qualified Negro baseball players," as he wrote, "who have been marooned in a hotel room for over a week, having been promised a tryout by your Boston Red Sox, who are now trying to renege on their promise and skip town." The Red Sox knew they had to have the tryout. So they called up Muchnick. They said, "Get them over here." They came over. They suited up, took the field, ran the bases, took a little infield, took a little BP. About 45 minutes later, they were called off the field. They were all thanked very much. They were all told the Red Sox will be in touch with you. None of them ever heard from the Red Sox the rest of their lives. But you know who was paying rapt attention that morning? Horrified. In his executive offices on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights. Branch Rickey. Because Branch Rickey was getting reports of this tryout. And the idea that Tom Yawkey, who he loathed, by the way, was going to somehow explode and blow up the plan he had in place for over a year now to sign Jackie Robinson. Now, we know if we could have gone back in time and traveled back in time, and we could have reassured Branch Rickey, Branch, have another cup of coffee. You have nothing to worry about. Are you kidding me? It's going to take Tom Yawkey 14 more years. Don't ask me how I know. I can assure you, you've got time. But he didn't know. So as soon as the Negro season ended in 1945 in September, Jackie Robinson traveled to Brooklyn, right there, where he signed a contract with the top AAA team of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Montreal Royals, and of course the rest is history. Wearing number 42, as he strode out to his position at first base, amid the din of cheering fans, of broadcasters announcing history, and of exploding flashbulbs capturing it, there were also two inaudible sounds at Ebbets Field that day. Of a wall falling and of a cheering that could not be heard with the ear, only with the heart. It rose from those not present physically, but spiritually. Those who could not be seen, but were there just the same. Moses Fleetwood Walker didn't live to see it. And by the time he died, broken, bitter, alcoholic, buried in debt, he couldn't imagine it. He was there. Bud Fowler, a man who literally traveled the world in order to play baseball, was now in Brooklyn. The Pullman Porters, some of them rolling within just a mile of Ebbets on their way north or south or west that day, they were there. The black journalists, they were there. The Negro Leaguers, past and present, those who had come too early and those who were young enough to imagine that they too might now walk through the wall, they were there. And the African-American veterans of the war just ended and those who had died in it, they were there. On this momentous day, a ball game was played before a crowd both present and cheering and another crowd silent and unseen. They watched the game and they watched the terrible wrong being finally righted. To be sure, even as a black ball player bounded onto an otherwise all-white field, racism was still alive and well in Brooklyn. And clear on across America, so many of the barriers remained in place. Many still are. But on this day, some of the hurt and the humiliation was salved. On this day, hope and faith that had long seemed to have run out seemed to magically be redeemed. On this day, the long arc of the moral universe seemed to bend improbably toward Brooklyn, New York, where it touched down on the grass and the dirt of a creaky old ballpark where the familiar white lines would no longer bar a black ball player. And in the bottom of the seventh inning, right there, when Jackie Robinson laid down a perfect bunt and raced toward first base, he was not alone. That invisible crowd was suddenly right there, running right alongside, willing him on. And when Robinson sprinted safely onto second base and caught his breath, they exhaled with him. After all, it had been a long 60-plus year uncertain journey, and they helped him get there. The next Dodger batter doubled. Jackie Robinson rounded third, and he was home. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, as promised, if anyone has a question, I'll tell you what, you can each have two questions. No, if anybody has a quick question, I'm happy to. Yeah.
Without putting you on the spot,
Go ahead.
What was your reaction when the Red Sox took down Yawkey Way?
That's a good question. What did I think about them taking down Yawkey Way? That's a tough one. I did a few stories at that time, and I talked to a lot of people, black and white, in the community. It's a tough one. You would be surprised how many black people and even Red Sox fans that I talked to that said, I think they should keep it up to remind people and keep the name out there. I understand what the ownership which is still the present ownership, was trying to do. I do. I think it's a difficult one. It's a little bit more shaded than taking down, for instance, Confederate statues across the South, which should have never gone up to begin with. But, it was Yawkey Way because he was the popular owner and longest owner in history of the Boston Red Sox. It never, until more recent history, seemed like it wasn't fitting that he should have a street outside the park named after him. But sensitivities and times change. And I certainly understand why the ownership felt that the name was now bound up in racism. Because Tom Yawkey was a racist. He was a racist. I love when people say, sometimes people say, do you think Tom Yawkey was a racist? I said, look, it's not what I think. The hell do I know? But I'm fairly observant, and if something walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, it's a duck. And I say, forget. Well, a lot of people don't realize this. Forget the fact that it took him 14 years. He would have never hired a black ball player if he hadn't been really forced to by the times. But forget that, which is sizable enough. 14 years, last major league team to integrate. Forget that for a moment. When he integrated, Pumpsie Green, 1959, calls up, meets the team in Chicago, gets into the game in the ninth inning at the old Comiskey Park against the White Sox. Guess where Pumpsie Green was a week later? He was back down in Louisville in the minor leagues. All Yawkey wanted to do was to be able to say, I did it, okay? Get the hell off my back. And he was back down in the minor leagues. Not only that, Tom Yawkey did not have a black, so that's 1959. Tom Yawkey did not have black employees. I'm talking about cleaning bathrooms and picking up peanut shells. Did not have a black employee at Fenway Park until 1964. So, was there good reason probably for taking down the name? Yeah, because Tom Yawkey was a racist. But he did a lot of good things too. He also put a lot of money into the Jimmy Fund and the Joslin Clinic, and that can't be taken away. But that was a long-winded answer. So I have some mixed feelings about it, because I don't think Tom Yawkey was an evil man. And I don't think Tom Yawkey, like Confederate generals, did things that were directly harmful to our country. But I think Tom Yawkey was a racist. He was a more benign racist. The way I put it in the book is he wasn't alone. Dan Topping of the Yankees was even worse. But the way I put it in the book is that Tom Yawkey was of that very benign kind of Southern genteel racism. And the way I put it is they liked their racism the same way they liked their rye whiskey. Understated, dry, but it's still racism. Anyone else? Anyone else?
How many teams were in the Negro League?
So when they start out, I think there were, if I recall, 14 founding teams. I think at their height in the early 1940s, I think there were 31 Negro League teams. And then by the 1960s, they begin to die out. By 1970, they're all gone. There's no Negro League teams. There were the Indianapolis Clowns were famous for, after the Negro Leagues had folded, they were sort of a ghosting Negro League team that often appeared at Major League ballparks too as entertainment. They were sort of like the Harlem Globetrotters for baseball. They did all kinds of crazy acrobatic stuff. But yeah, at the height, there were as many Negro League teams as there were Major League teams, and I think 6 or 7 more. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, In the book that I'm working on now, I try to wrestle with that a little bit, having grown up in Boston, and Boston is fascinating in that it has this dual personality when it comes to race. Boston in the 1830s is the home of the abolitionist movement. It was seen as the center of the anti-slavery movement. And in many ways, we can be very proud of Boston's progressive history. And there's this strange strain that is in there at the same time, right? It reared up during busing. It's reared up at ball games. I don't know what that is. Listen, I'm not qualified to. I simply don't know what that is, but I do know you're absolutely right about Bill Russell. There have been black players on all of Boston's professional teams that at one time or another had the same types of things to say, So who knows? I don't know. Like I said, I'm not qualified to. I just know the same thing you know, which is that, geez, that seems kind of troubling and it seems odd and it seems, but yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. Great point. So, I know you'd probably like to get home for breakfast. So, listen, thank you very much for coming and joining me tonight. You're the hardy ones. So thank you. As you see, I do have some books. I'm not going to take time and sit here patiently, so I'm going to start packing up. If anybody would like a book, I'd be happy to sell you one and to sign it for you. And meanwhile, yeah, I'm just going to kind of start packing up. So thank you very much. Be well. Bundle up Saturday.